Part-Time Hitter is brought to you by Friendly Forces, a 501c3 nonprofit committed to helping reserve component members seamlessly integrate their military service with rewarding civilian careers. We connect them with employers who value their unique skills and critical role in national security and advise organizations how to become more reservist-friendly. Check them out at www.friendlyforces.org. Friendly Forces is also brought to you by the Fratty Guard, a lifestyle brand for part-time hitters. Check them out at www.thefrattyguard.com and on Instagram at @thefrattyguard. Welcome everybody to another episode of Part-Time Hitter. Today, I am joined by my friend and former neighbor, Captain Nicholas Rodman, who is a TPU Military Intelligence Officer. He just saluted the camera in the Army Reserve. Nicholas comes from a sort of a, what would we call it, a policy, congressional affairs type background, expert on international relations, international intrigue, legislative process, all that kind of good stuff. So Nicholas, thank you for being here today.
Yeah, Eric, great to be on the podcast. Thank you for having me. It's a great honor, one of the highest honors I think in that really that I can say. Full disclosure, just I'm on this podcast expressing my own views and no one else's views, not the views of the government. And another disclosure too is I first met the host of this podcast back in 1987, around May of 1987, when I believe the host was brought back from the hospital after being born. So Eric and I do go back a few decades.
We do. So Nicholas, we've known each other roughly 36, 37 years. Nicholas begged to be on the podcast. I shot him down a number of times. And finally I said, what the hell? And here we are. Nicholas was my best man at my wedding. I was a best man at your wedding. And I bullied you into joining the military.
Yeah, you cyberbullied me. Or you actually just full on peer pressured me into joining through shame and a few other tactics. But I'm glad I did.
Well, aren't you glad I did that?
I am. I'm very glad. Yeah, it's been very fulfilling. I think the military certainly provides purpose in my life, and it has its moments, its struggles, its frustrations, but it's been very rewarding. I think what you did was very helpful. I think I saw your journey through the Maryland National Guard. You were enlisted as an 11 Bravo, and I saw your progression through state OCS too, and that kind of got me interested in the Army specifically. I think prior to that, I had been looking at the Marine Corps. I looked at the Marine Corps in college. Their OCS program at Quantico had an ankle injury, unfortunately, which kind of made me lose interest in it. I broke an ankle falling off a table, unrelated to the Marine Corps.
Nicholas was dancing on a table during a frat party. I assume not completely soberly.
We can
hurt his ankle.
We can edit this out. I assume that you'll be
that dashed his hopes of a career in the Marine Corps at that time.
Hopefully you'll be able to edit that out.
So you joined, 2017 is when you enlisted?
Yeah, so I did the 09 Sierra contract. So the beauty of the Army Reserve is you can kind of pick your own adventure. And I wanted to go MI. Obviously it has this mystique, which again, we'll delve into later on about whether or not that's actually true. But yeah, being a junior kind of career person in DC and national security, MI officer has that cool sort of label. But that being said, yeah, I was looking at even the Navy Direct Commission Program.
That's pretty much reserved important people, right?
Yeah.
Who don't have the time or energy to.
Reince Priebus, Hunter Biden, Pete Buttigieg. And not to knock on that.
Right.
There are people that have done that and actually, have done a lot of great work. And I believe they've elongated the duration of it, so it's not just 2 weeks. It used to be 2 weeks of Fork and High School, and then you were an ensign. And I know quite a few people who've done that. And service is service, but as an Army reservist, there's a little bit of a burn because it took to be MOSQ'd, qualified in my job in the.
Well, so before we get into like kind of your career path with the Army, let's talk a little bit, because you joined as an officer candidate on the later side. I think you said you were 9. So, you mentioned you were working kind of in national security. So what exactly were you doing in DC, like before you joined?
So I was a congressional staffer for about 8 years, and when I was a congressional staffer when I joined, I was previously working for the House Armed Services Committee for 3 years, which is the committee in the House of Representatives that authorizes the defense budget. And then after that, in 2014, I moved over to the House Republican Study Committee, which is technically the largest House caucus. It's sort of an internal think tank for the House Republicans. I worked on national security issues, energy issues, foreign affairs, intelligence. Essentially, long story short, is that we would just, summarize legislation. We do these Cliff Note ledge bulletins for members to kind of explain to them what they were voting on. A lot of times, the leadership would not give enough time for members to read legislation, but we would stay up and read the bills and provide analysis, and we would tailor each legislative bulletin to our members. So if there's an advocacy group in your district that supported it or was against it, we'd explain this to you, why they have that particular stance. But that was kind of the big gist of my job at the RSC, was to provide kind of in-depth analysis on national security issues that were.
So ChatGPT can basically do that whole job.
I would say, in terms of actually reading, explaining and synthesizing what the legislation did, sure. However, leadership would present a piece of legislation and then update it at 11:59 p.m. for it to be voted on the next day. They would add provisions in it, and oftentimes, like, we'd get hold of the bill language through various leadership would provide us the actual updated text. But there are things like it involved a lot more nuance, and trying to explain why such organizations supported it and were against it involved a lot more sort of, like, I wouldn't say ChatGPT would not be sort of able to provide that analysis. I mean, it involved, like, talking to people and knowing these groups and knowing who headed these groups specifically.
Sure.
We would also, I would organize briefings if I knew some topic was coming up. I had a briefing on PRISM, which is the Section 702 on privacy. I brought in the former head of the NSA to debate a privacy advocate. There are examples like that where I'd bring someone to explain crisis going on, the Ebola outbreak in 2014, for example, or Iraq and Syria sanctions, Russia sanctions, CATSA, which is this big Russia-China sanctions package that was going on. So there were various topics that would come up on the House floor, and we'd get our members brushed up and up to speed on as soon as possible. But that being said, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, so you did that for really essentially your whole post for 5 years. I know now you moved out of the area, had some kids, sort of recalibrating, but is your plan at some point to get back into that kind of work now that you're in, because you weren't an MI officer simultaneously while you're doing that. I think that kind of coincided with you moving, right?
Yeah, I became an MI officer towards the tail end. So I actually had to take a leave of absence to do basic OCS in 2017. And in 2018, I took 4 months off to do BOLIC, it's your Army officer job school at Fort Huachuca. And I got back in about early 2018, and then left the Hill maybe a year or so after to move to Seattle, where I'm at currently.
Did you find that people looked at you with a newfound respect after you came back as a second Louis?
I mean, we were living in DuPont Circle in DC, and quite frankly, I think the only time I ever got thanked for my service was by a tourist.
Well, I mean, your colleagues on the Hill and the members and whoever.
Yeah, I would say it credentials you a little bit. There was my employers were very supportive, and I'm very grateful to them. To be honest, like, working on defense policy, especially on the Armed Services Committee, you're looking at things at the 10,000-foot level. You're looking at budget items, you're looking at programs, military construction projects, etc. But then when you're actually, like, getting told to F off by a drill sergeant, that's a different story. I remember working on an issue related to running shoes that were issued to recruits at basic training. They were trying to make them Berry Amendment compliant, which means they had to be made in America. This was like an amendment by the New Balance lobby, as I called them. They were, the main congressman and the Massachusetts congressperson who, wherever the factory was in Massachusetts. But I remember being issued, like, non-Berry Amendment compliant sneakers at basic. They were like Asics or something.
And you said, hell no.
Well, I made a comment about these are, like, non-Berry Amendment compliant, and the drill sergeant was like, shut the up. Like, didn't care. Like, obviously,
As I
Yeah.
recall, they started calling you CID boy.
Yeah, the one of my drill sergeants I had 3 drill sergeants. One was a mortar 11 Charlie, one was a transpo convoy transpo guy, and then
Oh,
one was a 35 Golf, which is a geospatial imagery analyst, which is like an interesting MOS for a drill sergeant. But he like during basic training story time, he mentioned that he like spent a lot of time in a skiff, and he was like, "Which one of you, privates know what a skiff is?" And I stupidly raised my hand. I said, "It's secure compartmentalized facility." And then he like whipped out his little pocket knife and it was like, "You're CID, right? Like if you're CID, you're supposed to tell us. You're supposed to tell us you're CID." Which I guess I was like complimented, but I mean, I'd worked in a skiff. I had some experience in a skiff on that Armed Services Committee, and so I kind of knew exactly what it was. It was weird.
so they knew not to mess with you the rest of the time.
Uh, no, I think no, I don't. I mean, we were mature. Like the as I said, I was in '09 Sierra contract, so I was in a platoon of I think there are 5 or 6 other officer candidates going to OCS after basic with us, and in the same for the entire company. There are about 20 of us, and we were the drill sergeants kind of like viewed us as chaperones a little bit at times. They were like, well, there were a couple prior service people, like cross branches of Navy, a couple of Navy people and Air Force people, and they were definitely used as chaperones. And then with us, they were
Right.
like, well, you guys want to be officers, well, here's a little experience like managing a 19-year-old. They had higher expectations for us, but we also behaved relatively so to the youngins. But it was interesting. I actually learned a lot about myself. Learned more about myself in basic training than at OCS or even Bullock certainly. But like,
Yeah, I was nervous about you going down there because I know from experience you are probably less of a morning person even than me, and I am not a morning
yeah,
person. And
no,
I couldn't imagine you getting up at whatever time it was every day for however many months it was, 2 months or so. And then when I saw the first picture of you or video of you weeks in, because they were doing the social media stuff for like the families,
yeah.
I guess, I was just like, holy sh! I don't know how much weight did you lose? Do you know?
Like 40 pounds. I mean, to when I'm
That's
at,
it?
well, uh, yeah, I actually lost. I felt like cumulatively, it sort of was like OCS too. I lost just being in Fort Benning in the summer. I think I sweated out like at least 20 pounds. I mean, now I'm like at dad bod weight, which I'm not going to reveal to your millions of listeners because it's embarrassing. But yeah,
Millions, yes.
it was, yeah, it was. I mean, just everything's controlled. What you eat, how often you work out, your sleep for the most part. So yeah, I felt amazing. I had to like,
Were you in like a general? I don't quite know how it works because you didn't have a branch yet because
no,
you were going to OCS. So who were you? Who?
we were not, we were technically at Sand Hill, but we weren't like with the OSIT guy. I saw them during religious
Right.
services, but I was with a lot of 68 whiskeys and fuelers and a couple other random MOSs. So most of the I would say most of the company went to, was it Fort Sam Houston to AIT for their 68 whiskey school.
How did you feel about the quality of basic and drill sergeants while you were there? Granted, this was a kind of a while ago now,
Yeah.
but I feel like now it's gotten much, it's very different from even when you and I went through as far as like the way they treat the privates and like the fact that the privates have their cell phones and like stuff like that. So how was it when you went through? Was it still pretty rigid or
Yeah. It wasn't co-ed like Fort Jackson. I think Sill, Jackson, and Leonard Wood are co-ed. OSIT, we were Sand Hill for some reason. It might be co-ed now.
it's all,
Yeah.
yeah.
I don't know if that kind of changed the culture, and I'm not making a comment on that. I'm just more like curious of how that's like whether or not they could bend some of the rules more or less. The cell phone stuff, I mean, I've heard stories of like I'm not familiar with what the new Army policy is, but like, I mean, we were allowed every time we shifted phases, we were allowed like a 5-minute cell phone thing.
Yeah, I more or less had the same thing, but I don't know if it's true now, but a basic training company commander was telling me that they have to give these kids their phones now at in every evening because they suffer a literal withdrawal. And this was an active duty, basic training company commander. So you should know what he's talking about. That's pretty scary.
Yeah.
Or it's different. It's different. We'll put it that way.
Yeah. I mean, that's not, I guess I actually kind of enjoyed snail mail. I mean, you wrote, the host of this podcast is, I'm complimenting you sincerely, but you write very witty letters. You wrote, when you were at Basic, my dog had passed away at that point, and you wrote the funniest letter back to me saying that you were trying to get the flags lowered at half mast at Benning in honor of our husky. And then you wrote me a very funny letter, which is not appropriate for this podcast. And you also tried to weigh it down with an American flag patch to get me. And you also addressed me as Captain Rodman on the envelope to
Yeah, I was
deliberately get me
hoping,
killed.
I was hoping the drill sergeants would see it and accuse you of telling people you were a
Captain,
captain in the
which
army.
is, I guess now it's not. Now it's
Um,
true. But also it included a picture of a half naked man getting out of a swimming pool in a Speedo.
it was a man in a banana hammock, if I
Yeah, that's
recall.
right.
Anyway, it didn't work. It didn't go as
No,
planned.
thank God. Very funny.
So you went to basic. All right. So talk to me about OCS. And again, it's probably significantly different now than it was when you went through. I haven't heard great things about federal OCS, and I think even at the
Mm.
time you said you weren't overly impressed with it.
Yeah. Well,
And also, you were a holdover for like 6 or 7 months before you
uh,
even went, right?
7 weeks. Yeah, I don't think I could have psychologically made it
Uh,
7 months in a holding company. There was like an instructor. What I learned later was that there was an instructor shortage in the previous company that we were supposed to class up. So they shaved it by I think it was supposed to be 120, and it ended up being like 80, 90 people. And then we classed up 7 weeks later, and so we were in a holding company, which actually I found it that to be a little bit enjoyable. Like I mean, it was like a prep course for OCS. They took us out to the land nav course to teach us the terrain. And so when I actually had to do land nav, I knew Red Diamond or whatever it was called. Like I knew it very well. I knew it well enough to know that there's like a oddly placed cemetery at some part of it, in the lower part of it, which is kind of eerie. Yeah, they sort of like prepped us for all sort of the big challenges of the actual course. So and that was great. There are times when I was like cleaning pebbles off of the O course, which was kind of
well,
weird.
yeah.
Very like Zen
Um,
garden esque. But the course was good. It was okay. It wasn't, looking back at it, I really, it was a lot of mind effing, and they kind of like, I think at that point the needs of the army were they needed officers, they just needed people, and so they were not that many people were being cut, and they're being cut for like mostly injuries. One dude like literally broke his leg in the so it wasn't. This was in the class before me, but like the people that were getting cut were really not. It wasn't butts. The attrition rate was pretty low. I don't
right.
know what it is now.
Well, didn't you say that the cadre weren't great either? Because I feel like they stick a lot of the turds there
Yeah,
before as they're getting out.
I mean, not to talk publicly about our cadre, there were some issues with a couple of them. I had a good sergeant instructor. I'll say that he was excellent. But yeah, some of the other cadre were a little mixed. I'd say in terms of like they had like some personal and it's sort of like public indiscretions in front of us. They would just say weird things or just not show us sort of like what leadership is. There's one or two people that kind of did that, but I'm not,
And
I'm not
then
going to
did
name
you
names or whatever.
go? No, you came back.
And
You
my
didn't
memory
go
is a little
directly
hazy,
to
but
Bullock
it
after
wasn't a bad
OCS, right? You had
course.
a bit
I
of a
was there
break there.
unfortunately during the summer too, which probably impacted my morale, but it was definitely at that point, I think I was a little bit more seasoned. And so I would say basic was a lot more interesting to me than OCS.
Okay, so talk to me about MI Bullock.
So Bullock, I found to be the most intellectually stimulating class. It's three or four parts. There's a common core. They kind of refresh you on land nav, rifle, BRM, all this basic stuff, and then you do defense, offense, and stability. And the curriculum changed after the 2014 Russian invasion of
Well, it's
Ukraine.
always changing. But
Yeah,
yeah.
it's always changing. And so the big chunk of it was LSCO, large scale combat operation. That's conventional warfare in a nutshell. And I'm curious what it was like in like 2008. It was probably all coin, counterinsurgency, GWAT stuff. The stability, I felt like they kind of like skipped over. It was like a 2 week.
Well, from an MI perspective, I mean, you guys aren't doing combat operations anyway, so your job really shouldn't change whether it's a LSCO or
Yeah,
coin.
my personal opinion is Swiss Army knife. the Army and senior leaders have had a poor track record of predicting the future in terms of where the U.S. gets involved with militarily. And I think you need to have at least a basic understanding of every concept. And I think that there was a brush over of coin, and the Army leadership, or even above them, didn't just wanted coin stuff to go away. And LISCO, I feel like, is like ingrained in the Army's DNA since the Cold War. Defend the fold a gap. They did add a few things about like sort of the asymmetric hybrid warfare, which obviously Russia applies. It's conventional with a little spiciness of little green men in unmarked uniforms, doing subversive acts in Crimea, for example. But the curriculum was interesting to me, but it was also I felt like there should have been a little bit more of an emphasis on how a little maybe more humility in terms of like, we don't know what the future is, but we want to prep you for everything, every potential contingency, or at least give you the basic tools to understand what you're going to face.
So you're now a company commander
Mm-hmm.
of an MI company.
Yeah.
I think you said it was a HUMINT.
Yes.
I don't know how MI works exactly, but you haven't been to the career course yet, right?
No, I gotta get on that. So MI, it's interesting. First of all, it's not sexy. It really it's to give the main purpose of MI is to give an S3 operations commander an understanding of what the enemy is going to do. And then under MI, the officers we're generalists. I think that's in every MOS. We're the generalists. We assemble all the products and present them to the operation, the S3, for example. Under MI, there's different INTs. INTs are sources of intelligence. So you have your geospatial imagery analysts, you have your all source analysts, which are like almost like they do similar stuff to what officers do, but on a much more specific level. And then you have human intelligence, humaners, which are interrogators, for example, debriefers. You have counterintelligence agents. You have, those are people going after moles.
So who are like the rock stars? Who are the elite of the MI-35 series? Is it the HUMINTers?
I'm biased because I'm a company commander. I mean, I used to be in a sort of a general in a company that kind of did analysis and geospatial stuff. Yeah, I'm biased towards. I think HUMINT is the original MI. It's before these other tools kind of came about. You needed, the enemy is a human, so that's sort of the basic foundation, in my opinion. I mean, that's my selling point. And then you could talk to someone else, and they'll give you a different counterpoint to that. But I think,
well, as a CA guy,
yeah,
we deal a lot with people, and we collect information, not intelligence, right? And they stress at every possible opportunity that we do not do intelligence collection. You are not collecting intelligence. You will never utter the word collecting or intelligence, because that could get you in a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
So yeah, they were always telling us you're not a HUMINTer.
Yeah, I mean, civil affairs, you're supposed to bring goodwill. Like you're. I mean, there's different facets, right? I mean, because like then you have psychological operations, and you have other facets of it, right?
Yeah. CA, we do it all, baby.
Mm-hmm.
We're kind of, it's kind of public affairs, civil affairs, PSYOP, kind of the products we create can end up feeding, obviously intelligence.
Yeah.
There's like kind of like MP, SFAB, like it's civil affairs is kind of all over the place, which is what makes it cool.
Yeah. And you have
but ultimately you're dealing with people.
You do information operations?
Well, IO, within CA is an IRC.
Yeah.
So IO is about deconflicting all those other things I just mentioned. So we're involved in that, or we should be. In fact, you should think about going to the CA career course instead of MI, which sounds, do you even know what you're going to do for the career course?
Yeah. I mean, it's looking like MI until I die.
MI till you die?
Yeah.
You don't have to go to the MI career course.
No, I know. I don't, I mean, I'm stubborn. I don't like change, and it's what I know, and I'm afraid of the outside world.
Right.
Yeah, but thank you.
Actually, on that note, do you find that MI attracts a certain type of person, sort of a pale, sort of wimpy, nerdy, socially awkward type of person?
Not at all.
Just a stereotype?
Not at all. Not at all. I find that I think it attracts someone with charm, wit, maybe boyishly good looks, who likes music and fine dining and French literature.
So you didn't pick up on any trends at like Fort We Gotcha of the type
Yeah.
of person in the branch?
I know. Yeah. I that's a microaggression towards the MI community. We're taking note of that. I think that certainly it attracts a type of person. And the human world is very interesting. There's a
Someone flying a drone
no. We're doing
near
some
you?
plumbing work in the background. Sorry,
Oh,
our
okay.
toilet broke. Our plumbing underneath our toilet broke, so we're getting it kind of replaced. So MI, the question was, is MI attracting weird, eccentric, introverted people? It does. There's some strange people I've met. I've been told by someone I live with who is my spouse that I'm have some eccentricities, it's I think it's good. It's people that can see things that other people don't see. I don't know. People that are interested in things that are unique and
Savants.
they yeah yeah we're good with numbers and right, you're referencing Rain Man. I think that it's a
Um,
good community. I think that there's a lot of people that
so
desire it because
what
it
in your
sounds sexy,
opinion
and that's not necessarily
makes a
true. I think
good,
the
actually,
big
before I even go
thing
into that,
is sort of I
what are you
like it
guys
because
doing
it
as an MI, a HUMINT MI
being good
unit
at MI,
during
I guess it
intro
means that
weekend?
you have an understanding of the world, you have an understanding of different societies, and that's with certain geopolitical climate going on right now. A lot of the reasons why certain militaries fight the way they do is because they're a reflection of their societies that they come from, and if you understand that, you can be a good MI officer.
I don't know. I asked a question, but my internet might have gone out or something. But as a reserve or National Guard, I suppose, HUMINT MI unit, do you guys really get the opportunity to like train on your medals? Like, I don't
Yeah.
even know what your medal, like, how do you, like, what do you guys do?
So, I mean, for human, it's like interrogations. We did like an interrogation exercise, debriefing, stuff like that. I'm sure in geospatial, you're using fancy computer stuff. SIGINT, you're using, fancy computer stuff. Foxes, you're also using, some stuff, but you're also kind of building products for the S3 or S2. We do train, we do some serious training, and we're in the field, which is good. Like, we're doing tactical exercises. It's not just sitting in a skiff. It's not just going on Sipper and messing around on Sipper or whatever. It's like we're in the field, integrated with other units. I did a cross training with the National Guard last summer, and it was amazing. We were at this Yakima Training Center in Washington State, which is this huge piece of real estate, and we were running around out and about with the National Guard having fun.
Do you drill at Fort Lewis?
Yeah, I drill at Fort Lewis.
Do you ever work with the Ranger bat out there?
Other than drive by, no. But there's been some people that have come from there. I have a couple folks in my unit that have come from there. That world, like, it's a different breed, and they're high speed. That's all. I'll say that they're it's ingrained in their DNA at that point. If you make it through that, you're high speed, and they're value added to the reserve, certainly.
So what are your, actually, let me ask you this. What do you find most of the soldiers in your unit do civilian job wise?
It's interesting because I was in a unit in DC at Fort Belvoir, and it's all government contracting, government, the Hill, executive branch agencies, you name it.
Right.
Here it's tech. It's like Microsoft, Amazon, and some Boeing in the Seattle area, but it's hugely tech focused. It's people that work for like a semiconductor company. So it's a different breed of a lot of the tech stuff is they're really savvy at that. But it's just a different culture. It's definitely a reflection of the area. And you do have people who come in from like Idaho or elsewhere, but like in the Seattle, Tacoma area, it's specifically the tech's dominant.
Well, hopefully you're plugging friendly forces to your
I am.
formation.
And
Have you?
and
Have you?
I've been plugging friendly forces, and another random kind of it's sort of like Instagram page called Friday Guard that I've heard of, and a bunch of other stuff. But I've been plugging friendly forces.
You should. It's I founded it because it didn't exist when I was looking for jobs a few years ago, and I still use it today myself. So
Look,
You should plug
I
it to the soldiers at
I'll
every
give
chance
you.
you get.
I'm going to give you credit right now. 40% of the military is National Guard and Reserve. That means 40% of the military has most of them have civilian jobs. The reserve component is not 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year. As a company commander, it is I have nightmares. I sleep at night
Night terrors.
thinking of what could go wrong. It has bled over into my daily life. You need people looking out for reservists, because quite frankly, a lot of times their civilian jobs are just unaware of the regs, unaware of USERA. It's not malicious or anything. It's
Well,
difficult.
not it's that, and it's also like I know there's people they can't openly say it, but they're like, oh, I don't want to have to I don't want to either hire this person or let my team member, have to go do military duty and take time away from work. It's like that screws me over or my team over. But at the same time, it's like, okay, our military, which is 40% of that is the reserve component, we maintain the economic machine and the stability that our economy runs off of. And also, if you and me aren't doing it, then maybe your little brats have to go sign up and sit on a guard tower in Kuwait or something, and they might not want to do that. So like we're serving in their place. I think that people don't always realize or know that.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I think that the burden is increasingly being placed on a smaller amount of Americans, and that burden is being even more increased on the reserve component. Forgive the background noise. Something maybe culturally needs to change. The military used to be ever present in our society, especially after World War II. I mean, pretty much like everyone had a grandparent in that generation that served in some capacity, or the boomers had their parents serve, and that's changed. It's like the all volunteer force has changed the dynamic in our society. So you need organizations that remind people that there's still people serving in the military that are reservists and have civilian jobs and have to maintain their family life and the civilian
Well,
job, and then their military
yeah,
career.
and not only that, but without reservists help to bridge that civil military divide where
Yeah.
the military is very sort of isolated the rest of kind of the culture and society. So when you have people like us, daywalkers as they've been called, who
Daywalk.
kind of live in both worlds,
Yeah.
we help have each side kind of understand and see the other a bit more, which I think is important too. So let's pivot a little bit and talk about some current events. Obviously, you're a big policy guy, or you pretend to be at a minimum. Big things going on. We got Ukraine. What's your take on Ukraine? Obviously, that's been going on for a couple of years now. Probably about to see some pretty big changes here with the new administration and what the US's support to that effort looks like. So, what are your high level thoughts on Ukraine? What's going on, and what we should do or shouldn't do, or where that's headed? No pressure.
I think it's a lot more critical than what people perceive it to be, certainly even on both political sides. What's clear is that Vladimir Putin is not a friend of the United States, has never been a friend of the United States. And he wants to revive some type of pre-Soviet Tsarist empire. And the one thing standing in his way is NATO. And whatever you think of the relevance of NATO nowadays, post Cold War, is a separate story. But there's an element of I think his strategy is to dismantle and destroy NATO's credibility without ever going to war against NATO, and that involves eating parts of his former, the Soviet Tsarist former sphere of influence up. So that means gobbling up. In Georgia, he did that in 2008. He gobbled up South Ossetia and Abkhazia. In Ukraine in 2014, he gobbled up Crimea and Donbass, Luhansk, parts of those regions. And in 2022, he attempted to take the whole of Ukraine. And I think his ultimate goal would be, part of Moldova, with Transnistria, and expand that, and then ultimately Narva, parts of the Baltics, which I think is the ultimate prize, because what that does is that completely makes NATO irrelevant, because his calculation.
Is it
Yeah.
is it like an ideological ego type thing, or is it like, no, I want to control these key resources to help enrich and
There's
control?
two things. It's not like communist is mostly economic ideology. There's a political ideology in the sense that it was authoritarian one party rule. I mean, there's a little bit of a sort of he's kind of hard to pin down because it's some if you look at his economic policies, it's very statist. He's not a free market libertarian. He's not a conservative leader. On the his foreign policy is different in the sense that he will exploit certain views in our country about him being a defender of Christendom or whatever, which I think that's complete nonsense. I think he personally, is rumored to have a mistress who's like 16 years old. I mean, he's just not doesn't live by the book, so to speak. And Russia has high abortion rates. It's not a it's a certainly a Christian Orthodox country, but there's no religious revival in Russia right now. I mean, granted, yeah, the
How
Orthodox
old is
Church,
Putin?
he's in his 60s. I believe he was born after World War II.
He's not that old. I thought he was older than that, but like
Well,
if
he's had
I,
a lot of
isn't
plastic
he?
surgery.
Well, he might be the richest person in the world. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, his personal credit card is the state treasury, so he's definitely. I mean, I think part of it is it's a
Well,
revival
my
of
point is like, why
yeah.
can't he just off and he doesn't have that many more years on this earth, so he's going to spend it just engaging these little conflicts, and then he's going to die. Like, just take your
That,
billions and go live on a yacht.
well, at this point, it's like he's taken it too far in a sense that the war has gone too far for him to just back out. I mean, he'll get killed by a military member if he does that, which would be, I guess, ideal for us. I think the calculus in his mind is that he wants to. It's a psychological element to it too. He wants to revive Russian imperialism and Russian relevance in the world. But what I think he's failed to realize is to do that as a country, there needs to be economic revival. And what I'll ask you this, like, what has Russia created since Putin has been in power? Like, what have they invented? I mean, very little. The U.S. is a free society. We invent, the internet, ARPANET, internet, the washing machine, air conditioning, tech, the iPhone, AI has been flourishing here. It's really, advanced microchips. Like we still make stuff. We still invent stuff. We are still creative. We invented social media. We either invented or we're the world's incubator for it. Europe is mostly stagnant economically, and especially in tech and AI and everything. They regulate. They try to sort of stick it to us through regulations. And then in Asia, the Chinese have their own sort of model, which is to replicate and maybe improve on. And that's sort of TBD whether or not they're gonna outpace us. It's a
Their
question.
government is, because they don't have all the bureaucracy that we have to go through to procure and acquire
Certainly,
capabilities and technology.
certainly, and their IP theft is they're really good at IP theft. I mean, they're exceptional at it. I think that, but going back is that they're not creating per se; they're improving on, and but vis-a-vis Russia, Russia's as John McCain called it, it's a gas station with nukes. That's true. They were. That's not always true. To the Soviets' credit, it's a flawed system, but they had advanced rocketry. Their rocket engines used to be very, very, very good. The RD-180 or whatever it's called, it was actually still being used by NASA in the 2010s. They're just they did aeronautics. They were pretty impressive, but
I'm wondering how their military isn't completely, like, at least their army, decimated at this
yep.
point. After, how
No,
are they even still waging that war? And I know they're bringing in North Koreans, but aside from that,
I think that it's a culture thing too. Russian society can take casualties like no other society can. The famous scene in Gates of the
enemy at
Jude
the
Law
gates.
movie, Enemy at the Gates, where you have two Soviet soldiers at Stalingrad with one rifle. One gets killed and the other one picks up the rifle. That is true in this degree. Is they have very little regard for human life culturally.
But even like
That's
their
military.
weapons and their armor.
So, I mean, they also had large stockpiles of stuff, and their objective right now is attrition. It's a war of attrition. So they're hoping through their strategy is to break the West, break NATO psychologically, and have NATO countries withdraw aid. And so you're seeing a lot of messaging on, Ukraine's corrupt. There's biolabs, all sorts of kind of like unsubstantiated things about Ukraine, trashing Ukraine. I'm sure there's like corruption in Ukraine, but not on the scale of Russia. Russia, they've, as you said, Putin's the richest person on the planet potentially, and that tells you something. He didn't earn that through with entrepreneurship. I'll tell you that. Ukraine it's a democracy. Zelensky was democratically elected. Putin was maybe democratically elected in like 2000, and really hasn't really been democratically elected since. I mean, he's like sort of rigged it. He obeyed the Russian constitution, so he stepped down for 4 years, and he had Dmitry Medvedev take over, but then he immediately kind of jumped back in. It also helps that a lot of his opposition members have been shot or killed.
Fall out of windows.
Yeah, the serious ones, like
as you're going to do
Boris
after
Nemtsov.
this podcast airs.
Yes, probably. Navalny, he's brought back, it's called defenestration is what that term is, but he has these like token opposition members. There's still a Russian Communist Party, which is irrelevant. He has these kind of jokester opposition. Zhirinovsky was this other guy. But I think his objective is essentially to out survive Western aid to Ukraine and break Western will to keep supporting Ukraine. But I think
but if you destroy your entire army in the process, what have you really? You can't even accomplish anything else militarily. If all right, now we have parts of Ukraine, but we have no military to defend it or defend our nation.
Well, that's sort of true and not true, because I think he's definitely the army that attacked Ukraine in 2022 is pretty much decimated. The VDV units, they're airborne, they're like equivalent of the 82nd, was pretty much like decimated when they did an airborne drop into Hostomel out of north of Kyiv, and they got wiped out. But their credit, it's like they're able to regenerate, and they haven't done a full mobilization yet. I mean, they have to a certain degree. They've been sort of like,
I thought they were sending like old people and college students.
They're sending. Well, the initial part of it was like they're like ethnic minorities. Dagestanis, Tuvans, which are like in the far eastern part of Russia.
North Koreans.
Well, that's a separate country, but like he's sending people that are like ethnically, not to be like racial, but in
lower caste.
No, they're like Asiatic.
To them,
Siberian,
yes.
Like Siberian communities that are technically have always traditionally been marginalized, or people from the Caucasus, like Dagestanis, Chechens. In fact, there's a Chechen unit, I think, that's solely tasked to shoot Russian personnel who are retreating. So that tells you how they fight. That would never happen in the U.S. military. And I have Soviet doctrine on my bookshelf right there. And like Soviet doctrine is, if they don't do coin, they just destroy city blocks. That's what they do. They carpet bomb with a Tupolev 95 bomber or whatever, and they just drop bombs. And in Syria, they did that. The UN would provide them the location of Syrian in rebel-held controlled territory. The UN would provide them with the locations of hospitals so that the Russians wouldn't bomb the hospitals. And that would, of course, be the first thing that they would bomb. In the name of bombing Al-Qaeda and ISIS or whatever, they would mostly target the secular Syrian rebellion to protect Assad. I mean, they just have a different regard for human rights. They don't really have much of a strong regard for human rights. And this is the Russian government, not the Russian people, what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the Putin regime. And I think the Putin regime has less of a regard for human rights than even the Soviets did at this point. The Soviets were brutal in a lot of ways. This is sort of post-World War II. And Afghanistan, for example, was their big conflict, and they did commit atrocities, but it wasn't on par with what they're doing now and what they did in Syria.
So you went full MI nerd on Russia.
Sorry.
And I respect that. Let's pivot to China. Not happy with the Chinese right now. What is your prediction for what happens between us, with Taiwan, China, between now and 2030? What should we be worried about or tracking?
They're amphibious. I would say anti-ship aerial denial, A2AD, which is what their doctrine is. Amphibious assault capabilities, I think, is something to track, and their missiles. And also quantity. Their ability to regenerate and generate like weapon systems is insane. I mean, they haven't had a conflict, but it's mass. That's scary. I do think by two things that are working in our favor, Taiwan is an island, not glued next to them like Ukraine is. Taiwan is rocky. Taiwan also has a more capable military than Ukraine did prior to the invasion. The U.S. and the West, France has been providing them with weapons since the 50s, probably. And so they've had Western weapons. However,
What do you
they're,
what do you think China is
yeah,
going to
go
do?
ahead.
So if you're China, what do you do? What do you think they're going to do? Do they have the appetite to take Taiwan? I've heard they have a window
Yeah.
of time where it makes sense for them to move, which is, I think, between now and 2030,
Yeah.
maybe even sooner. What are your thoughts on all that?
I think the Ukraine conflict has at least bought us some time because had Russia steamrolled Ukraine, it would have given them the green light to do so. I think, psychologically, they saw what happened in Afghanistan in 2021 as a sort of, oh, the U.S. is culturally and psychologically will not intervene. They're retreating from the world, and there's this appetite not to intervene or stand up to treaties, etc. So it's changing. I think that they have. I think what they don't want to do is create a crisis that would blow up in their face and kind of like blow up in a sense that it would blow up the world economy, and that would impact them. And they have a lot of young men who are not. There's a gender imbalance, which it's not their kryptonite or whatever, but it is. They have a lot of. If you have a population, a lot of angry single men, that tends to lead to revolution or domestic instability, and I think they're concerned about that. And that's also partly motivating them to psychologically present to their people that Taiwan must be united and that imperialist forces are keeping them separate. And just as that sort of led them to fully gobble up Hong Kong and get rid of this sort of semi-autonomous status that Hong Kong had. This was the agreement that the British and the Chinese had knocked out after the 1997 handover. So I'm not going to predict when they're going to invade, if they're going to invade. It kind of does depend on what Taiwan does and what the U.S. does and what Japan, South Korea do and regional partners do. And I do think that it's not in U.S. interest for Taiwan to get gobbled up by China. Clearly, I think from an economic perspective and TSMC and just also from our credibility as a treaty ally of Taiwan, technically under the Taiwan Relations Act, we are obligated to provide them with defenses. And I think it would send shockwaves throughout the world if we allowed Taiwan to get invaded and taken over without a fight. And I also think that this notion that the Taiwanese have not been paying for their defense, there's a lot of historical reasons for that, and that's because of the one China policy. We've also been under pressure from China not to provide them with weapons, and same with the Europeans and their neighbors like in Japan and South Korea. So I think the key word is just deterrence. That's the key word for the next 5 years.
What are, what are
No,
your
so,
final
yeah.
what are your final thoughts on China?
I'll make this brief. I think the key word is deterrence. Obviously, they're hell bent on reuniting Taiwan with the mainland. I think there are various factors in the near future that can determine the outcome of that. So, the key word is deterrence. I think U.S. regional policy, as in from Japan and South Korea, Australia, etc., can successfully deter the Chinese. I think you kind of keep stability in the global economy. I'm not saying anything original, but I do think that the Chinese are looking at other events going on in the world that are going to impact their own decision making, and that includes Ukraine. I think there's a little bit more interconnectivity than a lot of people are saying, regional experts are saying. And I think if she views the Ukraine as a wash for Russia and leads to the demise of Putin's regime, for example, in a best case scenario for the US, I think that would give him tremendous pause in attacking Taiwan. And now if Ukraine were suddenly overnight steamrolled by Russia, that would also change his calculus. And I also think like what weapon systems we provide to Taiwan also matter. And I know historically the U.S. has been under pressure by the Chinese government, from an economic standpoint after the One China policy in the 70s to not provide as many weapons to Taiwan. And they're sort of had also this sort of tradition of kind of trying to the KMT has been the sort of traditional ruling party of Taiwan up until somewhat recently, has sort of had this sort of coexistence policy with China to not to seek independence. And periodically they've lost the majority in their government and the pro-independence party has won, and that's caused a lot more tension. But that's sort of why their defense spending has been sort of relatively low, probably on the scale of like a European NATO country, 2% ish. But now, given that China has become more bellicose, do you think that they should raise their defense spending? But it's also it's not necessarily their fault. They've had low defense spending. I think they've tried to keep tensions low, mostly for economic reasons. And I think we should certainly provide them with any weapon system they need to defend themselves. And I don't also buy this sort of zero sum game where if we arm Ukraine, we can't arm them. A lot of there are some systems that are duplicative, but there are other systems that are not. That you would use for a Taiwan contingency and not for a Ukraine contingency. So yeah, it's complex, and I do think things that go on in Europe are interconnected to what's going to happen in China.
So what are your final thoughts on the Army Reserve, on MI, and on the future of our military and our great country?
It's a good question. I think the Army, more than any other branch, is a reflection of American society. It's the largest branch. I think the newer generations are, we millennials, we look down on the Gen Zers and then even younger kids, but I think they have some value add to them. They're a lot more tech savvy. They question orthodoxies more, which is good and bad in the military. So I don't think we're screwed. I think we do have a younger crop of people who are just different, and they'll certainly bring things to the table that we never brought to the table. So I'm cautiously optimistic, I would say, is what I'm feeling.
Okay. I'll buy that. All right. Well, Captain Nicholas Rodman, thank you for joining us here today on Part-Time Hitter. Again, brought to you by Friendly Forces and the Friday Guard. We appreciate your insight on these critical issues, and we'll have to have you on again as kind of our talking head policy guy, if you're okay with that.
Oh, thank you. I'm honored. I'm truly honored. Truly honored.
Until you can start making the cable news network circuit, which you're not quite at that level, but maybe now you will be.
Yeah, it's C-SPAN. It's always C-SPAN, or I could call into one of those C-SPAN TV shows.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again, Nicholas, and to the audience, thank you for listening, and stay part-timing.